Professor Sanjay Reddy, thank you very much for joining us here at the Fung Global Institute. Let's talk about the kind of negative impact, firstly, about globalization on India.
Well, I would say that to think in terms of pros and cons of globalization isn't always helpful, because globalization is a complex phenomenon that has had complex effects. And I think too often we've tried to divide the world into two camps, those who are for it and those who are against it. And it just doesn't make sense to do that, because there can be different ways in which the globalization process can be handled, and it can be benefited from, or it can be harmful if it is not dealt with strategically and sensibly by countries. And I think that China is a very good example of a country which has benefited from the opportunities provided by globalization. And indeed, there are many countries which have successfully developed in recent decades, which have taken advantage of export opportunities in particular. And it would be hard, therefore, to think about globalization as being anything other than a source of opportunities in these cases. However, I think that if one looks beneath the surface, and in particular at those countries where it's had much more of an ambivalent effect, including India, then what one finds is that where some regions, some cities, some groups of people with certain kinds of skills, for example, have benefited tremendously from globalization. At the same time, there are very stark inequalities which have emerged within the countries, which are also associated with globalization. And that in turn has brought in its wake sometimes rifts within the political system and difficulties in bringing about a more inclusive process of growth and development, and one which is also politically and socially stable.
So which sectors of society would you say that it's had a negative impact on? We're talking about India just now.
I don't think that it has had a negative impact per se, so much as that the opportunities which globalization can potentially provide have been taken up very unevenly. To give an example, I think that whereas in China, globalization has led to an enormous boom in manufacture, so that China has become the workshop of the world, and it has led to enormous poverty reduction in China, perhaps the most dramatic example of poverty reduction really in world history in a short period of time, in particular because of labor being absorbed into manufacturing. Nothing comparable has happened in India. Manufacturing growth has been relatively tepid, and instead what one has in India are small islands of prosperity, where those islands are very much connected to globalization. We have places such as Bangalore, for example, which is famous for its outsourcing industry, but indeed many Indian cities. In many of those, the groups of people who are doing best are those who are either directly or indirectly connected to the provision of certain kinds of goods, but more especially services, to the world economy. But those are small, really, parts of the population in India, and there are very, very large numbers of people who are left out, who are in some sense in the periphery, both within cities and in rural areas. And I think that for India that's much more of a concern because of the way in which India has engaged with the world.
Let's just stick with globalization for now. It's a very big word. What do you mean exactly by globalization?
If one looks at the last 500 years of world history, or indeed one can go even before that if one would like to, and some people have done that, I think it's not difficult to see that not only has there been engagement between national economies connected over increasing distances, but that has been intensifying. The last 30 years or so, I would say, have been a period that are especially important historically, perhaps 35 or 40 years. There has been a qualitative transformation, I think it's not hard to argue, which has taken place as a result of a series of developments, some technological and some institutional. For example, one can think of containerization of shipping, which has made shipping much cheaper than before. Revolutions in communications technology, and developments in passenger transportation, and so on and so forth. And these together have enabled a much more integrated world economy than had been the case prior to that. Simultaneously, some countries have made very determined efforts to pursue exports as a way of developing. China is again a very good example of that, but before that there were other late developing countries such as South Korea which had done the same. And that of course required not just having a certain orientation but also developing the national infrastructure which would enable a country to have that sort of a relationship to the world economy. So that's what I mean by globalization. It's the whole series of factors which have enabled that integration, and that integration, of course, takes the form of greater trade flows, and more multi-directional trade flows of different kinds between different places, capital flows, to a lesser extent, flows of people, and of course there are also connections of communication and culture.
So, Professor, are we seeing a move in some areas, in some parts of the world, between some countries away from globalization?
Well, I don't really think so. You know, there are people who would argue that, short of what they conceive of the first best, which they often think of as multilateral liberalization of trade and perhaps of other things, some of them might even favor multilateral liberalization of capital flows, for example, nothing else is suitable. And they would argue very strongly against bilateral agreements, regional trade agreements, and so on. I don't really see the problem in that way. I think that as long as there are the fundamental changes that I mentioned earlier, technological changes and institutional changes, which have enabled countries and national economies to become more integrated, I don't think that there's any likelihood that that will in the short run cease. One of my favorite lines of Karl Marx is that there is no force greater in history than a low price. And I think it's very helpful in thinking about a number of issues. For example, North-South trade is likely to continue to be extremely important for this reason. It's very unlikely that the developed countries are again going to be, at least in the short or intermediate run, a place in which labor-intensive manufactures are produced. And that's because the developing countries in general enjoy a decisive cost advantage in the production of labor-intensive goods. Now, of course, there may be questions as to whether those goods will be produced in one country or another within the global south, and that will depend on the whole range of circumstances which makes one country more or less attractive as a site of production. But the basic contours of the world economy in this respect, I think, are rather set. And this is, of course, not to say that there's any inevitability about it, but it's merely to say that that these are facts which have to be addressed and dealt with by anybody who's concerned with shaping policies.
Let me ask you now about, from some quarters, is seen to be the negative effect of globalization. We've heard in some quarters in Africa now talking about the flood of Chinese goods undermining local economies, undermining local cultures and traditions in the way those goods may be manufactured, for example.
Well, I think it's true that many poor countries and also middle-income countries face a very serious challenge in dealing with a competitor such as China, potential competitor. Now, of course, there are also benefits which Chinese goods provide. There's no doubt about that. And there are the usual arguments that economists give as to why there can be gains from trade even in such a situation. But for developing countries which are seeking to transform their national economies and to industrialize as an aspect of that, it is a challenge. This having been said, China's growth is also an opportunity, potentially, insofar as these countries can supply not only natural resources, but perhaps also manufactured goods. And I think there has to be to China, there has to be a more creative way of thinking about China's relationship and a more conscious way of thinking about China's relationship with developing countries elsewhere that can make for a greater complementarity and coalescence of interest than there has always been in the past. But I think that on the whole, the notion that that China's enormous productivity and extraordinary capability to deliver low-cost goods need not only be a negative is correct. But I think that, again, one has to be much more determined about finding ways in which it can be a positive.
Professor Reddy, you mentioned your work is to do with ethics and economics. Could you talk about your work?
Sure. One of the arguments that I would make is that there has been a false dichotomy between economics and ethics, and that normative considerations or evaluative considerations have to enter much more deeply into the way in which we understand economic issues. Partly, of course, because economic decisions, economic policies, have to be guided by evaluative considerations of one kind or another, but partly because even the inferences which we make as to what it is that is taking place will often depend upon our judgments as to how seriously to take certain kinds of evidence as opposed to others. So in various ways, there is a role for judgment, and in particular for evaluative judgment or normative reasoning and in economics. And I think that economic students should be better trained in that, and economic researchers should not completely dismiss such reasoning. Rather, they should recognize that it's part of their condition, that they have to do it.
So what factors come into play then?
For example, let's take an issue such as inequality. With a society as a whole, inequality is not a straightforward concept to define, because the incomes of some people may be increasing relative to those of other people. The incomes of other people will be decreasing relative to those of other people. And what one thinks of that complex phenomenon will depend on what weight one gives to the increases as opposed to the decreases. This is happening today in the world economy as a whole. The recent work of Branko Milanovic and others, for example, has shown that there are parts of the global income distribution where there are considerable absolute and indeed relative improvements in income. And there are other parts of the global income distribution where there are decreases in relative income at any rate. And the question of how to evaluate all of this is not straightforward. It depends on the particular judgments we make as to what is desirable and why.
What kind of judgments are we talking about, and how would that affect the outcome of the research?
To give another example, some of the work that I've been doing on global poverty estimates in the past has emphasized that it's not straightforward to determine who is poor anywhere, but it's certainly not straightforward to determine a single global standard with which one could add up the number of poor people in different countries and come up with a single global number. And if one is to have any hope in conducting such an exercise, one has to start with a set of criteria which one could favor on evaluative grounds, one could think to be sound from an evaluative perspective, and which one could then apply in different countries of the world so as to create comparability of the resulting poverty headcount. So that's an example in which a very concrete empirical exercise of determining how many poor people there are in different parts of the world depends on a prior evaluative judgment. But there are many other examples. I would say that if we want to think about something like real national income, for instance, and to ask the question of whether one country's living standards are higher than another country's living standards, or whether one country's national economy is in some sense larger than another country's national economy. Even in such elementary conceptualization and measurement questions, there are issues which arise as to what to value and what not to value.
So we should be moving away maybe from some of the standard measurements in terms of wealth distribution, poverty. Is that what you're saying, ultimately?
I would say that we should be much more conscious and reflective as to what it is that we're doing. And I think that some of the work that some prominent economists have done of late, for instance, the commission which Fitoussi, Sen, and Stiglitz were together co-chairs of, which presented some proposals as to how to measure well-being of societies and monitor the progress of societies, is an example of what such more self-aware economic activity would consist of. In particular, they recommend that instead of blindly fetishizing GDP, the total national output measured at market prices, we should marshal a whole range of other indicators of the level of well-being of a population and how that changes over time, using what they call a dashboard approach, so that instead of there being a single indicator, there would be multiple indicators which we were aware of and which we monitor over time.
It's going to be hard to shift away from something that the world has been so embedded in.
It's something we do at our peril. That's one way to put it. I mean, we can certainly focus on such indicators, but to focus on single indicators blindly is very often to miss all the other things that are happening. I noticed in Hong Kong today as I walked around, for example, that I had a characteristic itch in my throat, which I have in some Indian cities as well, and I've had in other Chinese cities, which is associated with air pollution. Air pollution is something that obviously has a tremendous impact on everyday life. In fact, it has a very deleterious impact on the health of people. Yet, it's something that we don't include when we calculate measures of GDP. Now, this is a critique which is well understood. Nevertheless, it's worth making, and it's an example of what happens when we don't pay enough attention to the value framework which should undergird our economic analysis.
And of course, it's very important to bear in mind when countries are so much on a drive for progress and economic growth. If you forget those kind of things, then your growth is really going to be very unstable and uncertain.
It's certainly true that there are questions of social stability and political stability and so forth which arise, even from a causal point of view, quite apart from the question of what is valuable. And if one focuses too narrowly on the wrong things, one will miss them. If one looks at both India and China, for instance, one of the interesting features, as you know, of their recent growth path has been the enormous increase in inter-regional inequalities, interstate inequalities in India's case, inter-provincial inequalities in China's case. And China, of course, has been dealing with that in its Go West campaign. And to some extent, it appears that that may be working at least at reducing deprivations and raising living standards in Western China. In India, I think nothing as conscious has been attempted, certainly not anything as significant by way of reducing interregional inequalities. But that is something which I think is a consequence of the fact that some parts of these countries have taken advantage of globalization earlier and more, partly because they've been able to due to geographical or other reasons, and other parts have not. And that creates not just inequalities which might be undesirable from some point of view, but it also creates political and social strains. So I think that it's very sensible to be aware of such transformations.
Professor Reddy, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely fascinating, especially the last bit about measurements of growth.